Chapter 1 Stopover. As a disclaimer, there is gore and heavily detailed scenes. Mary's nerves were slowly getting to her. She had a quite splitting headache due to the heat and the children arguing in the backseat. Joshua was 11, and he made a game of teasing his 2 years younger sister anywhere and everywhere. For the last time, stop fighting. Mary was startled by her own voice, but apparently it was effective because the children quieted down immediately. They just weren't used to sitting still for too long. Things weren't about to get any better either, since the road to Brisbane was at least another 200 kilometers long, 200 kilometers with no air conditioning, with endless barren plains and the scorching sun for scenery. The weatherman had predicted that this might become the hottest and driest Australian summer in years. "Are we there yet?" Sheila whined. Mary wiped sweat from her forehead and sighed. Sheila didn't insist. Finally, silence. Just like last summer, they would spend several weeks of their vacation by the shore. Mary was already longing for the cold ocean water. "Whoa, cool," Joshua said after silence that barely lasted a few kilometers. He stuck his head between the two passenger seats and pointed outside excitedly. Mary saw it too, a silver-colored slide coiled like a python. She couldn't remember it being there last year. It wasn't a logical place for a slide, in the middle of nowhere with hardly any people passing. "Please, Mom, can we stop for a minute? I want to go on the slide. Please, just once." Before Mary could respond, Joshua was backed up by his sister. "Yes, Mom, just once. Please." "All right, one time, and then you have to get back in the car. We still have a long way to go." Mary slowed down to park her car. She thought a short stopover would calm the children down a little. At least she hoped so. Joshua opened the door and jumped out of the car. Sheila followed in his footsteps. In her enthusiasm, she nearly tripped over her own feet. "I'll race you," Joshua roared. "Be careful," Mary shouted after them. While the children ran towards the slide, she greedily drank from a water bottle that was already lukewarm. She could kill for an ice cream right now. Her mouth was sticky. There wasn't even the slightest breath of wind, and every move she made felt like an effort. She strolled over to the slide, which was in the middle of a wheat field. The monstrosity loomed up from the stems, and was a stark contrast with the clear sky. Some beams reflected off the silver pipe. "Careful," she called once more, when Joshua was already climbing the steel steps. Mary estimated the slide to be almost 10 meters high. Joshua was at the top. Proud as a peacock, he waved at his mother and then disappeared down the pipe with a loud "Yee-haw!" "Wait for me," Sheila yelled, but he was already gone. Joshua's cry of victory had already died down when his sister was halfway up the stairs. "I'm coming," she cheered. At the same moment, a dull thud could be heard inside the slide, following by hellish screams and raw echoes. Sheila snorted with laughter, probably because she thought her big brother was playing another prank, but Mary knew right away that something was wrong. She was afraid that her son had broken a leg or an arm on the way down, or worse, that he had hit his head and had lost consciousness. She ran towards the slide. "Joshua!" she shouted, her eyes filled with tears of fear and desperation. She didn't get any response, and that only scared her more. She gasped for air. Just when she was about to call his name again, she heard a hollow rumble from within the slide. Bop, bop, bop. It sounded far away at first and suddenly grew louder. Bop. Something was on its way. Mary looked inside and was so shocked by what she saw that she recoiled. She fell backwards into her wheat, wide-eyed, with screams frozen in her throat. The object that came hurtling down the slide rolled right into her lap. It was Joshua's head, chopped off just below the chin, with frayed ribbons of meat, where his neck had been up to a few seconds ago. In a reflex, Mary pushed her son's head off her. Her fingers were covered in blood and quivered like an aspen. She tried to scream once more, but she was shuddering so badly that her voice cracked. Through the reflection inside the slide, Mary saw a network of razor-sharp knives, big knives, small knives, jagged circular blades, even minuscule razors, all interconnected like a propel that covered the entire circumference of the slide. It was spinning around without making any noise at all. It was a diabolical mechanism made to destroy lives. Mary looked for her son inside the labyrinth of reflections, as though she still cherished some hope he would make it out alive, but that home soon turned into a nightmare. The body that had once belonged to her son came sliding down in unrecognizable strips and chunks, followed by a river of blood. The red pulp followed out of the silver pipe and seeped over the edge onto Mary's legs. A finger floated in the blood somewhere, a small, innocent finger. Mary didn't dare look at her side, but it did anyway. Joshua's head lay between the wheat. One of his eyes looked at her helplessly. The other eye was closed. His face contorted into a mask of pain. She couldn't believe it. Very briefly, the world around her seemed to falter. She felt dizzy, and everything fell silent. Ear-splittingly silent. A short moment that felt like it lasted an eternity. Until she heard Sheila's frail voice. "I'm coming down, Mom!" Chapter 2. A Town Where Strange Things Happen. Every year since my son Lucas turned 10, he, my wife Janet, and I have taken a week-long vacation in Vermont. Years ago, my wife's father left her a small cottage by a lake I had never heard of, in a town I had also never heard of up to that point. A perfect getaway spot, tucked away from civilization. We ventured out every July, the night before spent, excitedly packing suitcases full of clothes, coolers with snacks and drinks, and affixating our modest rowboats to its rickety old trailer. Dinner on these nights were always the best. My wife spared no expense, spending hours whipping up meals that can make even royalty jealous. We always awoke the following morning at the crack of dawn, hopped into the car, and had a breakfast at a nearby diner called Cleo's in preparation for the trip to come. From there, we began our 8-hour trip to Vermont. After the first year, my wife and I had mapped out every gas station stop and rest area for fuels up and restroom breaks. It became a sort of ritual way we went about it. For years, everything on our drive went according to plan, save for this last one. Last year, the highway that covered the last 60 miles of our trek was undergoing road work and was completely closed down. We had no choice but to take the designated detour through back roads. It had begun to rain pretty heavily before we reached the turnoff for the detour, and we almost immediately became lost. Signs became too difficult to see, and as not slide off the road. We were moving nearly 15 miles per hour, slower than the posted speed limit. After an hour or so, we wound up in a small, run-down village called Erin's Crest, according to our map. It was nearly impossible to make out any distinct observations about the town as we drove through the narrow, single-lane streets, only ever catching quick glimpses of lanterns above sidewalks or hanging from storefronts. My wife and I decided that the weather was making things far too difficult. We decided to pull into the first parking lot we saw to wait the storm out. Upon doing so, I turned off the car, closed my eyes, laid my head back against the rest, and listened to the rain. My wife was quite frustrated. There had been no notice of rain on her weather app, and she desperately wanted to know how much longer the storm would last. By now, we could have been enjoying our vacation, but instead, we were stuck in some backwater town, trapped by the cruel forces of Mother Nature. I hadn't realized it when we initially pulled in, but we sat in the parking lot of a diner. From what I can make out, it looked very similar to Cleo's back home, as if my mental note on the subject turned on an invisible switch. The lights for the diner flickered to life. In big familiar neon pink letters, Chloe's. As soon as the sign came on, the rain stopped. The sky was still nearly black with clouds, and thunder could still be heard off in the distance. I nudged my wife and indicated towards the sign. "Huh," she uttered. "Didn't realize there was a chain." "There aren't," I added. I craned my neck to check on Lucas. He had fallen asleep. I can't say why, but I felt a sudden need to take a closer look at the diner. From the parking lot, it looked exactly like the one back home, as if it had been copied and pasted, or even picked up and moved to our location. Something about it just struck me as odd. "Hey," I half whispered to Janet. "I'll be right back." Without taking my eyes off the neon sign, I stepped out of the car. My wife was asking me something, but I was too focused to notice. For some reason, the diner had my complete attention. I walked towards the establishment, occasionally looking around the lot for any signs of life. We were alone. I made my way up to the window by the entree and peeked inside. Nothing unusual. Then the car alarm went off. I turned to see my wife leaning over the driver's side, trying to switch it off. My son was now stepping out of the car, his hands over his ears. The alarm chimed off as my son approached. "Dad, where are we?" "We just stopped to let the rain pass." "Come on, bud, let's get going." We hopped back in and started off down the road. Further into town, we came across another unusual sight. Police cars blocked the road along with sawhorses, the word caution painted on them. An officer stepped out of one of the vehicles and held his hand up, signaling me to stop. He came over and tapped on my window. "Good evening, folks." The officer's voice was deep and scratchy. "You'll have to turn around. Been a real bad accident up ahead." "What happened?" my wife asked, leaning over to see the officer better. The officer looked into the backseat at Lucas. "Probably best the young one doesn't hear the details, ma'am." I nodded and thanked him for sparing us the info. "What brings you three to Orange Crest, if you don't mind my asking?" "We're on a trip to Vermont. We own a cabin up there. Detour took us off our path. Any way we can get around the accident?" The officer gave us directions that would take us down a few lesser-used streets, leading us to another highway. We thanked him and turned around, a difficult task with a trailer on such a small road. By now, the clouds had mostly dissipated, and evening light filled the sky with dim orange and blues. We were 2 hours behind schedule, and Lucas was getting restless from being in the car for so long. 15 minutes later, we were met with another roadblock, similar to the first. There were police cruisers and more sawhorses with caution painted on them. Another cop approached our car after having us stop. I nearly bust out laughing with anger. It was the same officer as before. "Good evening, folks," the officer said. "You'll have to turn around. Been a real bad accident up ahead." Dumbfounded, I turned to my wife. Her expression was the same as mine. "You don't remember us, officer. We were just here a few minutes ago," said Janet. The officer stood staring at us a moment, his face absent of any expression. Probably best the young one doesn't hear the details, ma'am." "Are you all right, officer?" I asked, puzzled. Again, he just stared. "What brings you three here, if you don't mind my asking?" "What the fuck?" I asked the officer if it would be alright for me to step out and talk with him. "Sure thing, sir." I rolled up the windows and stepped out. The air was much cooler than it was back at the diner we stumbled upon. "So you don't recall us pulling up a few minutes ago?" "No, sir," he replied, sounding a bit peppy. "I'm a little concerned that, would you like to see them?" He cut me off. Cut off guard by his question, I stared a moment. "What? Would you like to see them?" "See what?" I asked. "Their bodies." At this point, I was freaked out. "What do you mean the officer interjected. "Come," he began walking to the cruisers. "Come see." I looked back at my wife through the window, motioning towards the officer in disbelief. She shrugged but waved at me to join him. I obliged, just as curious as she was. As the officer and I maneuvered past the blockade, he started humming to himself. I looked over at him, still confused, and he turned back to me. I quickly broke our gaze and surveyed the surrounding area to avoid awkward eye contact. The cruisers were empty. Up ahead, past the flashing lights, were what appeared to be two bodies in the road, covered by gray tarps. When we reached them, the officer stood between, pointing each of his hands at the deceased. "Pick," he said. "What?" "Pick which one you want to see first." "No." "Fine," he grinned. "At the same time then." He knelt down and peeled back the tarps, revealing the faces of the dead. In an instant, my knees gave out and I fell to the floor. Not possible. Not real. It couldn't be. Beneath the tarps were the bloody faces of Janet and Lucas. Feeling a strong sensation of dizziness, I tried my best to stand upright. I began backing away from the scene before turning and running full sprint back towards my car. I stopped a few yards ahead. There in my car, my wife and son, alive, looking at me with confused expressions. I waved at them as if to say, "I'm fine." Janet's eyes then wandered to somewhere behind me. I looked as though she was screaming while pointing in my direction. I didn't even hear his footsteps, but now the officer stood behind me, and a knife was plunged into my lower back. The pain was immense. I dropped to the ground again. The officer, kneeling in front of me now, grabbed me by my hair and yanked my head up to look at his. I loved the faces. They're the climax to their story, the final words expressed through a dead stare. It's my favorite part. He stood and turned toward the car. I could now hear Lucas and Janet screaming. My wife frantically tried to open her car door, to no avail. "Pick," he said calmly. "What?" I felt consciousness fading away, the desire to close my eyes strengthening with every breath. I couldn't even feel the pain anymore. I was too tired to. "Pick one." I was unable to even get a word out. Talking was too difficult a task in my wounded state. "Fine, both then," he replied to himself. He walked over to the car and hopped into the driver's seat. My wife had climbed into the back to protect Lucas. The officer stared at me through the glass, smiling in a malignant smile, his jaw unhinging like that of a snake. He then turned to look at my wife and son. The last thing I saw before blacking out was him inexplicably scarfing down my family. When I came to, I was in a hospital bed. To my left, in another bed, was a young woman. Her arm was wrapped in a thick gauze. Blood soaked all the way through and dripped beside her. As I watched it drip, my pain returned, and with it, the memories of what happened. A nurse rushed in. I hadn't even realized it, but I had begun to scream. After settling down, numbness took over my mind and body. I was informed by a doctor that I had been asleep for 6 weeks. I didn't know what to do. My family had been officially reported missing, and an investigation was underway. I talked with Shrinks and the authorities, telling them my whole story. None believed me, but they were at least able to rule out my involvement. My car had been spotted by a traffic camera a few days prior, being driven by an unidentified woman. After a couple more days in bed, I was allowed to get up and walk about. The hospital itself seemed normal, but something in particular caught my eye. I was turning from the cafeteria when I noticed a sign above the keycard, locked door, to the ward I had been checked into. The sign read, "Curious Cases Ward, Authorized Personnel Only." Chapter 3. White with Red. A man went to a hotel and walked up to the front desk to check in. The woman at the desk gave him his key and told him that on the way to his room, there was a door with no number that was locked and no one was allowed in there. Especially no one should look inside the room under any circumstances. So, he followed the instructions of the woman at the front desk, going straight to his room and going to bed. The next night, his curiosity would not leave him alone about the room with no number on the door. He walked down the hall to the door and tried the handle. Sure enough, it was locked. He bent down and looked through the wide keyhole. Cold air passed through it, chilling his eye. What he saw was a hotel bedroom, like his, and in the corner was a woman whose skin was completely white. She was leaning her head against the wall, facing away from the door. He stared in confusion for a while. He almost knocked on the door, out of curiosity, but decided not to. This disinclination saved his life. He crept away from the door and walked back to his room. The next day, he returned to the door and looked through the wide keyhole. This time, all he saw was redness. He couldn't make anything out beside a distinct red color, unmoving. Perhaps the inhabitants of the room knew he was spying the night before and had blocked the keyhole with something red. At this point, he decided to consult the woman at the front desk for more information. She sighed and said, "Did you look through the keyhole?" The man told her that he had, and she said, "Well, I might as well tell you the story. A long time ago, a man murdered his wife in that room, and her ghost haunts it. But these people were not ordinary. They were white all over, except for their eyes, which were red." So, have any of you had creepy encounters on a vacation? Was it paranormal? Well, that's all for now. All credits go to the writers of these stories. If you want to stay updated with the new uploads, subscribe to the podcast. Also, I highly recommend downloading today's episode and other episodes so you can listen to GEEK Zombie Podcast without pesky ghosts interrupting you. Until then, you'll be hearing from me soon.